All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome. Today we are going to walk through some basics of the Hardy-Weinberg principle. So you should have the Hardy-Weinberg practice problems activity opened, and let's just kind of walk through some of the basic background that we already covered in your notes, but let's sort of reinforce some of that. So if we take a look, right, your activity gives you just a little bit of background, so let's read through this together. So in 1809, the English mathematician J. H. Hardy and the German physician Wilhelm Weinberg independently demonstrated that dominant alleles do not automatically replace the recessive alleles in a population. Using algebra and a simple application of theories of probability, they showed that the frequency of alleles in a population and the ratio of heterozygous individuals to homozygous individuals does not change from generation to generation unless the population is acted on by other processes that favor alleles. Their discovery, called the Hardy-Weinberg principle, states that the frequency of the alleles in a population do not change unless evolutionary forces act on the population. The Hardy-Weinberg principle holds true for any population as long as the population is large enough that its members are not likely to mate with relatives, and as long as evolutionary forces are not acting. There are 5 principal evolutionary forces: mutation, gene flow, non-random mating, genetic drift, and natural selection. These evolutionary forces can cause the ratios of genotypes in a population to differ significantly from those predicted by the Hardy-Weinberg principle. So if we take a look at the questions, right, first and foremost, what did Hardy and Weinberg independently demonstrate in 1809? If we go back to the text, right, the text tells us that they both independently demonstrate that the dominant alleles do not automatically replace the recessive ones. And this really drives back to the way that sex cells are created and the way that those eggs and those sperm come back together when we make offspring. So for those of you who maybe remember your Punnett squares, the fact that you could take a capital A, separate it from a lowercase a in a single parent, and then bring them back together in those Punnett squares to predict the genotypes and phenotypes, the genetics and the physical expression of those genetics of the offspring, those are the basic underlying principles of genetics. And that is what Hardy and Weinberg were saying here, that when we look at the way that those genetics play into how traits are passed on from one generation to the next, assuming that there's no evolutionary forces at play, then the dominant alleles aren't going to replace the recessive ones, and vice versa for that matter. All right, so it's all just about separate out genes, create sex cells, bring them back together in the offspring, and so long as those are the only factors involved going from one generation to the next, then our ratios of dominant to recessive alleles should remain constant in the population. Okay, let's take a look at question 2. So according to Hardy-Weinberg principle, what causes the changes to the frequency of the alleles in a population then? So there are evolutionary forces at play if those frequencies of alleles are changing from that static predicted baseline that Hardy and Weinberg predict. So if we're seeing frequency changes occurring, that's because something other than just sexual recombination, creating of sex cells, bringing them back together to make offspring, something else is going on. And generally that's a result of some sort of evolutionary force. So what are the 5 principal evolutionary forces then? So one of those forces is mutations. If I go and mutate DNA, that means that I have changed an allele. Either I've created a new one, I've eliminated one, or I've just manipulated one into a different form. Gene flow, also going to be a principal force. This is the idea of immigration and emigration from populations. So immigration being somebody moving in, and as a result, they're bringing their genetics with them. So that's going to alter the makeup of the population. Or emigration where somebody is leaving the population and as a result taking their genetics with them. And again, that's going to shift the ratios of what's present in that gene pool. Non-random mating. This is sexual selection. So sexual selection is a version of natural selection where individuals are choosing mates preferentially for a particular trait. A lot of times it's the females who are choosing a male because of his particular set of characteristics, but it can also be competition between males fighting over a female. So if there's that choice or that competition, because of sexual characteristics, then that is natural selection based on sex. And so that is what we're talking about with that non-random mating. I can't have that because then there's preferential choice. That's an evolutionary force. Um, Genetic drift is also one of these principal forces. And genetic drift, really, we're talking about a subset of the population getting isolated or only left behind after a particular event. And as a result, that small subset of the population may or may not be genetically representative, I should say, of the original population. And so we may be missing alleles completely. The ratio in which the alleles are present in that new subset of the population probably doesn't reflect the original frequencies that were present in the larger population. And so genetic drift gets down to the idea of population size, right? So in order for those frequencies to remain constant, we need to have a really large population size, because if we don't, we have the increased likelihood where you are mating with relatives. We've got incest potentially going on. And if we look at the genetics as to what happens when you tend to mate with closer and closer relatives, you have underlying genetic issues that show up as a result of allowing the frequencies for sort of harmful alleles, especially recessive harmful alleles, to become more common in the population, even though they're not beneficial. So that would seem like a counterproductive process, and that's because that population is just so small, you don't really have a large pool of genes to pick from. And then natural selection as a whole. So I can't have any sort of preferential choice, and I put choice in quotation marks here, right? Because there's no real choosing happening. That's just a way for us to discuss what's occurring. But I can't have a trait be favored by the environment over another. Everything needs to be an equal playing field in order to keep those frequencies constant. So what effect do these evolutionary forces then have on the ratios of those heterozygotes and homozygotes in a population? Well, if those evolutionary forces, one or more of them, are in play, then they are going to cause the ratios of those genotypes to differ significantly from the predicted Hardy-Weinberg no change baseline. And number 5 says, how can the population size cause a change in the frequency of alleles in a population? Think about what we just said. So the smaller the populations, the more likely you're mating with relatives, the more likely that's going to cause the frequencies of alleles to change at random. There's not a predictive manner in which those allele frequencies increase or decrease. So that goes back to that concept of genetic drift.